Good evening, travelers, and welcome to Carnage Falls. Whether you stay a while
or stay forever, we hope your visit is something to remember.
the stories you are about to experience are all true.
Even if they never really happened. I'm Tilly.
And my name is Yillit, and we hope you have a spooktacular stay.
Please, follow me.
But be careful not to stray too far from the path.
Strange things wander around in the dark.
Carnage Falls is just a town like any other,
With folks like any other.
but we hope not to bore you to death with our stories.
It's one of those little towns, you know?
A nice place.
A dying breed.
Let's take a walk down Lehman Way so we can begin to explore these tales from Carnage Falls. First off, we're snooping around into a tenant's private correspondence with her landlady. Of course, they have a very close relationship.
Dear landlady, hello. I'm writing to you because, well, you've been seeming a bit down lately, and I wanted to let you know I will always be there if you need me. We barely know each other, but I'm never more than a few rooms away. You'll say it's none of my business, but I know about your boyfriend. Your ex-boyfriend. The way he talked to you made me want to take his teeth. I'm so glad he moved out. All that about him thinking the house is haunted? Ridiculous. He had to go. Oh, there's something you should probably know about the attic skylights. Well, now there's a skylight in the attic. A skylight without glass. That strongly resembles a hole in the ceiling. I sort of accidentally installed it. Now I know what you're thinking, but I have a plan. How will this new skylight fit into the overall aesthetic of your house? It's a bit drafty, but it's actually rather nice. Add some type of curtains in the summer, maybe some plywood in the winter. It will work just fine. It is strange to think we've lived together for so long, but are yet to be properly introduced. But it is true. In the mornings, we miss each other in the halls, you to work, me to my routine. Sometimes I wave goodbye to you from the upstairs window, but you never look up. And then we miss each other in the evenings. You eating early, me only creeping out after 9. Your cooking smells delicious, but I thought it might be rude to join you. I know you are a very busy person, and I respect your space. You're a good person too, a kind person. I've never met anyone quite like you. Not that I meet many people. You may not know me, but I consider you a true friend. I've gotten to know your little peculiarities over these past few months. I know you hum while you're cooking and occasionally have conversations with your cats. I know you like to read recipes or instructions out loud. You often sketch that windmill down the road. You lose your reading glasses constantly. They are either on the nightstand or next to the bathroom sink, by the way. You don't leave the house on Mondays. You work as a therapist. Now, I know sometimes your work can really scare you. There's nothing to be afraid of. But sometimes you cry yourself to sleep. You are such a restless sleeper. It's fascinating. One time, I reset your alarm clock just so I could watch you sleep longer. Oh, your cats are adorable. They seem to really like me. They may have learned to drink out of your water glass from me. Your cats don't like the dry food you give them, but they hardly mind when I eat it. I give them mice, so it's a fair trade. I don't like mice. Their bones are too small. You know, we've actually spent many evenings in each other's company. You reading or watching TV or sitting, doing nothing, and me, your silent audience. I am skilled in being out of sight, out of mind, and you are skilled in not looking behind you or listening to the soft sound of falling footsteps. Sometimes I wish things were different, though. Sometimes I wish you would look behind the couch or under the bed. Oh, about my rent. I know it's a bit late to start discussing it, but the usual method doesn't seem to be working with you. I've been releasing live crickets into your room, but you keep putting them back outside. Would you prefer an alternative form of payment? I could start excavating the raccoon skeleton I found in the hollow space behind the upstairs shower. I don't think the whole thing will fit through the gap under the sink, but I could bring it to you in pieces. Or, perhaps, you'd like the frog corpse I found down by the creek? I'm afraid I've already eaten most of it. For this month's rent, I have placed a lock of my own hair inside your pillowcase. If this is not sufficient, please, let me know. We have so very much to discuss. I think we should meet, or at least introduce ourselves. After all, we live together. Whenever you want to talk, don't hesitate to call out for me. I am never more than a few rooms away. Sincerely, your tenant. Oh, P.S. In this envelope, I am encasing my collection of your lost eyelashes. As a show of good faith.
Gee, sounds like somebody has some issues. Speaking of issues, let's circle back around to Tabitha, the best therapist in town. When Tabitha started her practice, she never realized how high stakes her line of work could be. Her new patient, an aspiring food critic, is dealing with a very rare condition.
I started seeing Sarah Mclanda about 6 months ago. She seemed like a pretty typical patient. She just wanted someone to talk about her anxieties with. Everything was going all right for the first few sessions, and then about a month into her therapy, she began to hint at the real reason she was here. She made a joke about if I saw her on the news. She said, "Then you'll be able to tell your kids I was that crazy lady's therapist." I didn't really think much of it at first, of course. Patients say things they haven't thought through pretty often, so I usually just try to let things go and focus on what they came to me for. At her next session, Sarah told me that she was struggling with her identity. So I offered her resources on gender identity and sexuality, but she told me she wasn't struggling with that. She told me, "I've been thinking a lot about the people around me, how who I surround myself with affects my personality. I think I want something more from the people I'm around." I encouraged her to look for better friends. As the weather got colder, Sarah's descriptions of her friends and partners made less and less sense. She began to describe tasting them. And I told her even I didn't think it was a good idea to sleep with all of your friends. Use protection if you do. She laughed at this, which I thought was a good sign. She also began to talk about her ever-evolving palate, how she was loving red meat more and more, but just simply wasn't satisfied with it. About a month ago, Sarah started her session with, "Do you know what Wendigo psychosis is?" I told her I didn't, and she said, "Good. Don't look it up. You'll only think I'm a freak." I told her I didn't think she was a freak and that normal people can go to therapy just as much as freaks can. So the minute she left my office, I took to Google. I looked up Wendigo psychosis. And the first result headlined, Wendigo psychosis, the probably fake disease that turns people into cannibals. I spent hours reading different articles, and according to all reputable sources, this disease doesn't actually exist. Wendigos are just some Native American myth meant to keep groups together in the winter, nothing more, nothing less. At our next session, I started by telling Sarah what I'd learned, that Wendigo psychosis didn't exist. She looked as though I'd kicked her puppy and asked what I meant, so I told her what I knew. Wendigos aren't real, this disease is fake, and cannibalism is wrong. She didn't seem angry or even violent, she just quietly picked up her things from my office and left. 6 days later, when I called to confirm our next appointment, even though she didn't answer, the next morning she was at my door. Her hair was a mess, and she had these dark circles under her eyes, and she had this dark something under her nails. But she was glowing with enthusiasm for therapy, so I let her in. I asked her about Wendigo psychosis, and she said she didn't want to talk about that, so she spent half an hour talking about this amazing steak dinner she'd had the night before. I tried to steer the conversation back to anything, her sleep, her mental state, but she stopped me, saying, "This is my session, right? I want to get this off my chest." And then she launched back into her spiel about the food. I would never label myself as this rare steak kind of woman, but it was just so good. I think I'm going to eat raw meat every night. And it didn't even require any side dishes. That's how you know a dish is good. And can you believe I caught the meat myself? Our one-way conversation about her steak dinner was finally put to an end by the session timer going off. I closed the session with, "Sarah, you're a lovely woman and a great patient, but I don't think this is going to work out. I'm going to write you a referral to another psychiatrist, maybe one more knowledgeable about steak, so you'll have someone to share your interests with." She went quiet at this. I could tell I'd made her uncomfortable. The room and the air was cold and still. Finally, she said, "I don't want another psychiatrist. I'll just go." After I escorted her out of my office, I turned back to see the headline of a newspaper she must have dropped. Elementary school teacher goes missing. Patient confidentiality forbids me from telling anyone what happens in our sessions, so even if Sarah had done things to that teacher, I couldn't tell authorities unless I knew there was a threat to another person. So I kept my mouth shut. I had to give Sarah the benefit of the doubt, because every week as I see another headline of another person gone missing, no body is ever found, of course, I have to hope it won't be me next.
I guess Sarah just wanted a safe place to discuss her new taste in friends. Our next tale might seem sorrowful, but don't worry, it has a sappy ending. I think it would be better for you to hear it from August themselves.
Autumn always makes me think about Lucia. Her smile, her hair, her kindness, her ambition. She was always so excited about little things, like the orchard we would drive past on dates. Every fall, Lucia and I went on picnic dates together. Our very first date was in a small field near the apple orchard, and it became our tradition. We always took the same road out of town. So many little traditions on a day that isn't special to anyone else. Every year, we drove down Lehman Way, passing right by the windmill and the orchard. Even though I had never been there, I felt drawn to it. Lucia always joked about hopping the fence and picking some of the apples, but in 3 years of fall picnics, I never actually went through with it until the 1st of October, 6 years ago. It was hazy and beginning to cool down as the daylight faded. As we reached the end of the orchard, we'd driven past 1,000,000 times, Lucia stopped the car. I wasn't sure what she was doing, but the twinkle in her eye told me it wasn't smart. I looked out my window to see nothing but rows of trees with apples scattered on the ground below them. There was a soft fog rolling over, making it hard to see the depth of the orchard. "Come on, August, you never do anything fun," she said. She tugged on my sleeve. "Fine, just this once," I replied. I dragged my feet behind her. She lifted her leg over the wire fence and tumbled into the grass on the other side. I asked her if she was okay and hopped the dented fence, bolting toward her. She was covered in leaves and scratches, but she nodded. I helped her up, and she dusted herself off. "Let's go," she said, and she skipped down the row of copper-colored trees, which were dotted with ripe apples. I felt the breeze kick up a little as I walked down the row following Lucia, and the fog curled around our feet. When Lucia got to the end of the row, she grabbed a pile of leaves off the ground and tossed them into the air, letting them fall all around her like confetti. We laughed, and I walked more quickly toward her. Being far away from her always made me feel a little anxious and lonely. But as soon as I would catch up to her, she'd run down a different row of trees, and I followed. Finally, I caught her, and she took my hand as we walked back toward the car. But my anxious feelings didn't fade. As soon as the car was in sight, Lucia began skipping, and I walked a pace behind her. I watched as she reached on her tippy toes to a big, ruby red apple and yanked it off the hanging branch. I couldn't explain it at the time, but a chill shot up my spine. As Lucia stopped to wait for me, she took a bite of her stolen snack. When I got to her, she offered me a bite, but I declined. Instead, I kissed her on the cheek. She smelled as sweet as apple pie. On the drive back into town, Lucia looked out the car window into the hazy orange sky. I don't remember seeing her fall asleep, but when I pulled into my driveway, She had the side of her cheek pressed into the glass. I tried to wake her, but she wouldn't come to. So I got out of the car and walked around to her side. I caught her as I opened the door and carried her in the house and laid her on the couch. I didn't want to move her again, so I left her there. Went to bed without her. Then, in the middle of the night, I was startled awake to the sound of the front door slamming shut. "Lucia, is that you?" I shouted. I grabbed my sweater and ran out the bedroom door. She wasn't there. I ran around the house looking for any sign of her, but the house was empty. I ran out the front door to see Lucia starting the car. I ran towards the car as she sped off into the night. I was so confused, but I knew she wouldn't just leave without a reason. So I got dressed and grabbed the motorcycle out of the back and took off after her. She was headed down the same road leading to the orchard. But why? When I pulled up to the car, it was still running. I got off my bike and ran to the driver's side. The seat was empty, though it had been stained with blood. There was blood on the ground too. The blood led into the orchard. I hoped it wasn't her, but I had to see for myself. The blood led to the fence we hopped over earlier that day. I followed the trail into the trees till I was led to a particular tree. My heart sank as I looked up to see Lucia, or what seemed to be her, being struck by tree branches in her arms, legs, and her stomach. There were roots growing from her chest and binding her to the ground. As the sun began to rise, all I could do was run, cry, and run.
How do you like them apples? I guess you could say Lucia really was the apple of August's eye. Anyways, our friend Cassidy has to make a long-distance call. A very long-distance call. To a friend who has moved away. Very far away.
Please leave your message after the tone. Beep.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Margarine. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Margarine. It's Cassidy. Cassidy Mars. Cass. You always called me Cass. We were friends. Best friends. Back in, when was it? 2nd grade. Before you moved away to, where was it? Australia. No, New Zealand. You were only 10 when you moved to New Zealand. It's weird to think that you aren't 10 anymore. Are you? I guess in my mind you'll always be that little 10-year-old running around wearing that stupid green fedora. But my memories from that time aren't the clearest. I don't remember your brother's name, but I remember he always cut his hair super short like they do in the army. And I remember both your parents were dentists. I think. I remember you were scared of dogs, and your favorite Disney princess was Tiana. And I definitely remember your birthday parties. The last time I saw you was at your birthday too, wasn't it? Yeah, it was your 10th birthday. I was still 8 and deadly jealous. I was at your old house, Pine Elementary School. I always thought that house was massive, but I guess I was just very small. Even now, I can see the exact layout of the party in my mind. Food and gifts on the patio, cornhole and musical chairs under the maple tree. I remember being scared to play musical chairs with some of the other kids. Some of them were 12. And then we had cake. I remember your cake was blue with a goldfish on it. The whole party was under the sea themed with blue cake and blue balloons. Margarine, you used to love anything ocean related. Mermaids, Atlantis, sharks. Do you still watch Finding Nemo obsessively and make sailboats out of popsicle sticks? No. Probably not. Well, after cake, you opened your presents. Catherine Cates gave you a model dinosaur making kit and tickets to some circus. And Sadie Hooper gave you a pet rock. And Sadie's baby sister tried to give you her pacifier. And Lizzie Jett gave you Eyewitness Planets on DVD. And I gave you... I don't remember. Well, then you want to take your new pet rock upstairs to meet your other pet rocks. So you asked your parents. I remember your parents' names were Maria and Laurel. Yeah, they said yes, so we all scampered upstairs. Us guests sat on the bed and you shut off your rock collection. But it took very little time for our minds to wander. And then the game began. I suppose it was inevitable. Collect any group of kids between the ages of 8 and 12 and they'll all eventually start playing some version of the game Truth or Dare. Truth or Dare is both every kid's nightmare in elementary school staple. I never wanted to be called Cowardly Cass ever again, so I knew I had no choice but to choose Dare. Looking back, I can't even remember what I had to do. Just that it was terrifying. Some other kid had to drink hand sanitizer. People have died from stuff like that. When you chose Dare, it caused an absolute uproar. It was a well-known fact amongst us kids that you were fearless, but it was your birthday, so you weren't just fearless, you were untouchable. I dare you to climb the maple tree in the backyard. I dare you to slide down the banister. I dare you to go into the bathroom alone and say Bloody Mary into the mirror 3 times. I don't even remember who said it. It was probably one of the older kids, but it could have just as easily been me. I'll do it, you said, with that look in your eye, the Margarine Walks about to get us all sent to the principal's office look. You walked down the hallway with your head held high, and we all crammed against the bathroom door. And then the sound of the light being flicked on, water in the sink, then the sink being turned off, then Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary. Silence. And then Frankie Foster tripped with such a force that both his shoes went flying off and they hit the ceiling. I laughed so hard, I cried. And then when we had finally all stopped rolling on the floor, someone said we absolutely had to tell Margarine, so I knocked on the bathroom door. Silence. I'm sorry for what I did next. It was stupid and immature, but all I could think of were all those times you would hide behind a door, and then you would make me open it, and then you would jump out, and I would scream. I didn't want to scream. All the other kids would laugh. Cowardly Cass. So, I opened the bathroom door. I remember it being dark, which was weird because the light had definitely been on earlier. It was warm, almost humid, and the tiles felt somehow unfamiliar under my sneakers. And I reached out for the light switch and brushed against something wet, a towel. And then I grabbed the switch, and it was warm and wet. And then I turned the light on, and then I saw something. I saw you. And then Sadie Hooper's mom was taking us all to the park, and we weren't allowed back in the house, and you weren't with us. And Mrs. Hooper told us this story about how when she was younger, her sister died, and she kept saying stuff like, it gets better, and of course things get better. Someday I wouldn't be 8, and someday I would drive a car. That would be better, right? And then my mom came to pick me up. but I snuck back into the house to get the sweater I'd left in your room. When I got into the house, the only person I saw was your brother, sitting on the stairs and sobbing. I asked him what was wrong, and he said Margarine was gone. And I asked him, where had you gone? And he said, I don't want to know. He was being silly. I had heard teenagers can be silly sometimes, so I passed him on the stairs without another word. And then I got my sweater, and the upstairs hallway smelled different. It smelled like the time my dad showed me how to gut a fish, and I threw up. And I found I didn't want to walk back down that hallway again. I didn't want to walk past that closed bathroom door. So I stayed in your room, sobbing, until my mom came and got me, and she carried me to the car. I thought she'd be mad, but she wasn't. And then I went to your going away party. It was pretty boring. You weren't even there. And people kept saying you were, but you weren't. I looked all over that church and no Margarine. And people would say stuff like, oh, she's in a better place, or she's where she can be happy forever. New Zealand sounds like such a great place. The way the first word is new, it means it's the improved version. And how the second word starts with a Z. New Zealand. You know, I was sad when you first left, but I certainly hope you're happy there. Now I understand. You're in a better place. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Margarine. Happy birthday to you.
And now we are going to a better place. The Hot Plate, our local diner. Ronette, a waitress, had an encounter with some unexpected house guests a while ago. Her confession about that night is really out of this world.
As time has gone by, my memories of most things in my youth have faded. But what I do remember is that night, even though it seems like it was half a lifetime ago. I still lived all the way out on Lehman Way. I can't remember my first kiss, but this memory is burned into my brain. Waking in a cold sweat, the sheets tangled around legs, heart beating a mile a minute. Only a few moments prior, I had been sleeping peacefully. I looked around my room, trying to get my grip back on reality, everything in its place. Then I heard a loud noise, caused me to fall onto the cold floor with a whack. Quickly, I realized crackling static was coming from the radio on the corner nightstand. The static faded in and out, jumping from station to station. 1 minute a woman sang a jazzy tune, her voice then morphed into a drowsy news host talking about the stock market, which in turn faded into classic rock. The radio hopped stations with such speed that soon all the voices became a disjointed wail, a cacophony filling the air. I got to my feet and stumbled over to the radio and turned it off. In the short time the radio had been on, I developed a dizzying headache. The wall in front of me lit up. A brilliant blue light covered the room. I stood, frozen in fear, staring at my shadow on the wall. Slowly, I turned around. Every inch of my room was flooded with light. My window, which appeared to be the source, was blindingly bright. Then the radio jolted back to life. A distorted version of a song I'd heard 1,000,000 times filled the room. I reached behind me and fumbled with the dial, not taking my eyes off the window. Slowly, I stepped forward towards the window. Strangely, my feet didn't make any noise as I walked, even though I was on a very old and creaky floor. Everything was so still. I reached out and placed my hand on the windowsill, running my thumb along the rough wood. With the other hand, I pushed the shutters open and leaned into the light. There was a flash of multicolored lights, and then darkness. Only after that night did I realize the lights didn't turn out, but it was my eyes that had stopped working. I fell backwards, hitting the floor, completely soundless. I brought my knees to my chest and didn't move for what felt like ages. The silence was broken by a series of small footsteps around my room. Either the thing had many legs, or there was more than one. Footsteps weaved around the room, on the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling above me. I buried my face in my knees, bracing myself for the worst. I heard the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. The noise came from the other side of my room where I had kept a crystal vase. The footsteps came close to me. A heavy, wet breath on my arm. I swore I heard the whispers of words I could not comprehend. Even though I was blind, I squeezed my eyes shut. Then the thing went silent. I stayed huddled in a ball for what was probably another hour, paralyzed with fear. Once again, everything was silent. My memories of that night end there. I was woken the next morning by a cheerful bird song. I opened my eyes to find my sight restored. I looked around my room, everything in its place, nothing disturbed, nothing but a bad dream. With relief, I got to my feet and tentatively walked to my bedroom door. I glanced at the corner and froze. On the floor was a shattered crystal vase. After that night, no one I told believed me. People dismissed me. Oh, there goes Ronette, always telling tall tales. So it's been... I can't remember the last time I told my story to anyone. Getting a reputation like that makes you keep your mouth shut.
Look, I know they weren't exactly invited, but she made some totally baseless accusations about her guests. The bog on the edge of town is finally being replaced with a hotel for visitors to Carnage Falls. Visitors just like you. We hope you'll have a nice stay there once it's finished.
Every day, Morp and I would go for a swim in the pond together. We'd love to explore the bog, and he loved adventure more than anything. Morp's greatest thrill was a new and exciting adventure, and I was always happy to come along. Last week, we went swimming, just like always, enjoying the peaceful summer sun and the sweet smell of the grasses. We lazed around in the cool, soft mud and watched the bugs buzz around, occasionally snacking when we felt like it. I had never been happier. I don't know exactly when we noticed it or who noticed it first, but there was a rumbling, soft but persistent. The water quivered with anticipation. The grasses seemed to dance a little more nervously in the wind. It got louder. Morp touched my leg to his and said, "Maybe we should go check it out." I agreed, of course, and we hopped away towards the sound of the noise, away from the safety of the pond. As we approached the source of the noise, even the ground seemed to tremble. Morp was a bit ahead of me, but he stopped dead in his tracks. "Pluto, look," he said, as he put his leg against mine. I don't know exactly how to describe it is what I saw. It was like nothing I've ever seen before. It was bright yellow and about 1,000 times bigger than Morp or I was. Its nose, if you could even call it that, was enormous, and it seemed to be smelling the air constantly. The sound of its merciless, unrelenting roar made my body shiver like a leaf. Morp was the first to react. "Pluto, we have to get out of here," he said, and he started nudging me back towards the water. Still numb from the sight of this beast, I hopped as fast as my legs could take me. We were still a ways away from the water's edge, and as we approached, we saw something else, just as petrifying. I had only ever heard about Vergs in my Gog story from Tadpolehood, but this had to be one. It was tall, almost as tall as the bog trees, and it only stood on its back paws. It was standing awkwardly near the water's edge, and it held a giant, massive tube in front of its front paws. I pulled Morp into a patch of grass to hide. It was almost impossible to see through the grass, but Morp and I watched as the Verg, which was brightly colored and moving quickly for such a large creature, held the tube up to the water and released a white spray. It stood there, staring at the pond, waiting for something. Morp and I watched, croakless, too scared to even breathe. For those moments, the only sounds were the ever-present chirping of birds and the new but equally persistent rumbling. After an eternity, the Verg turned and walked away. Morp sighed with relief, but I kept watching the water. The spray had dissolved, but the water smelled bitter and acrid. I hopped over to the footprints the Verg had left in the mud, searching fruitlessly for answers, but there was nothing. After a moment, Morp dipped his toe into the water. "It seems okay," he said, although neither of us had any way of actually knowing. Morp offered to swim home first, just in case, but I said we might as well both go, and so we returned to our home, a small island in the middle of the bog. Morp and I tried our best to ignore and avoid the Vergs and their beast, which we had named the Bert after a tadpole who teased us growing up, but I could tell he was becoming restless. Morp insisted that we could befriend the Vergs if we tried, but I thought it would be for the best to ignore them and hope they would leave us alone. The rumbling got louder and closer every day, and when it was next to our pond, just a few hops away from where we were hidden, Morp croaked to me, "Pluto, we have to stop them." He hopped towards the beast, croaking as loudly as he could, hoping to negotiate. I felt a splatter hit my face. He was gone in an instant. I don't remember swimming away without Morp, but it really hit me when I got home that he would never swim with me again. The rumbling kept getting louder and louder, but I stopped paying attention. The bog, or at least what was left of it, seemed to die with Morp. The grass had laid lifeless, even in the wind. The trees had almost entirely disappeared, and with them, the chirping of the birds vanished. I rarely left my home, but when I did, I didn't see any other creatures besides myself, the Vergs, and their terrible, murderous beast. I was also becoming sicker. My legs felt weak, my skin was sallow and dry, and half the time I could barely muster up the strength to croak. It wasn't long after Morp's death when the Vergs found me. I heard their heavy footsteps as they approached. One of them had a massive box in its paws. I was frozen in place as the walls came down around me. The box was dim and small and lonely. The Vergs croaked loudly to each other, and their movements jolted me. I needed Morp there, but he was gone. The pond Morp and I always swam across. The excitement of new and crazy adventures. Even the grasses that we hid in when the Vergs came are only a memory. My cage is dark and cold and too dry, and a Verg comes by and stares at me and tries to touch me with its dry paw. And I crave the memories of sunny afternoon swims, the way that Morp croaked my name, of our beautiful home in the bog.
Well, that was unforgettable. What an absolutely riveting tale. Let's turn our attention to Sadie Hooper, one of Carnage Falls' sharpest young minds. In her diary, Sadie discusses the new circus in town, which is making a killing in sales, of course. Her night at the circus was pretty intense.
Dear Diary, as I write this, I'm sharpening my knife. I imagine the satisfaction that will come from that silver tip coated in red. At least, I think they bleed red. They took her. And now, they will pay. It started like any ordinary day. Working in the shop, mending buttons, taking customers' measurements. But around noon, Erica came into the store. She was practically skipping, her long blue skirt swaying around her. She leaned on the counter and looked up at me with a smile. She pulled a little white flyer out of her pocket and unfolded it so I could read it. The Starlight Circus was printed in an ornate, swirling script. I finished reading the details on the flyer and looked down to see Erica beaming up at me, her eyes wide with desire. One doesn't just say no to a 10-year-old with big, bright eyes. That night, we dressed in our finest outfits, as directed by the flyer. Erica in a silky white dress and pink satin shoes. Me in a red gown and heeled leather boots. I tied a pink ribbon in her hair and we headed off to the circus. We walked past the town, just past the old windmill. There were a lot of people heading there as well, and soon we walked in a procession to the large wrought iron gates of the circus. All the other people there were in top hats and ties, ball gowns and heels. I pulled the flyer Erica had given me out of my pocket. Under the pronouncement of the circus was sunset to sunrise, printed in plain font. It was almost depressingly simple compared to the fantastical script the Starlight Circus was written in. As we waited, the anticipation for what was continued beyond the gates was palpable in the air. After another 20 minutes, the last bit of sunlight was consumed by the horizon and a loud booming sound rang through the crowd. It sounded like the ringing of an enormous church bell. You could hear every creak and grind as the gates swung open, a sound that has haunted my dreams these past few nights. When the gates had finally opened, a beautiful white light illuminated the area around us. I grabbed Erica's little hand and we walked with the rest of the group into the circus, like moths drawn to a flame. Once inside, I could no longer hear the sounds of the city or the fields outside. It was all replaced by the hushed chatter of the other patrons. The only other noise was a whimsical tune. I couldn't identify what instruments were being played or where it was coming from, just that everywhere we walked, the music followed. I took in my surroundings. Everything looked slightly off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Finally, as I laid my eyes on a ballerina dancing outside a tent, it came to me. The circus and its performers were all in black and white. The dancer's hair, skin, eyes, costume, and the tent she stood in front of were all varying shades of gray. Her hair was large and wispy, piled on top of her head. At the time, I would have described it like cotton candy. But now, in my memory, it's a nest of spider webs. She noticed me staring, she waved. Awkwardly, I waved back. How did we not recognize how inhuman she was? The way she practically danced on thin air. When I come back, I will take pleasure in watching her suffer. Then Erica pulled me into the heart of the circus. It was deceptively large. Tents stretched back as far as the eye could see. An ornate carousel spun in the courtyard, adorned with animals I couldn't identify. Innocent children going up and down, around and around. 2 acrobats in tight gray clothing ran past us. They hopped up on a platform and began to perform a complex routine that involved many flips. One acrobat stood on the other's shoulders. He lifted one leg and pointed his toes. The standing acrobat began to twirl, the boy on his shoulders staying as still as stone. His leg pointed in an angle that no human should have been able to achieve. A thunderous applause came from the audience that gathered around. Tonight, I will take my knife to the back of their knees. As we continued to walk, we passed a series of oversized and ornate bird cages, each of which contained an exotic beast. Except for one. The gate swung back and forth, blowing in the wind. Then Erica pulled me over to a booth where a man was selling sweets. I purchased 2 bags of caramel corn, and he gave us an overly wide smile as we walked away. I can't wait to break his teeth. The caramel corn was sickly sweet, stuck to the roof of my mouth and in between my teeth. I looked down to see that Erica had already finished her bag. She looked up at me and smiled. I smiled back. I saw that her hands were coated in a sugary mess. I threw my bag away and led her over to a fountain where we washed our hands. As we washed, the sticky mess came off, but when I pulled away, my hands were completely dry. Looking back, the water was neither cold or hot. It simply felt like nothing. After that, I remember the emotions more than the events. Behind the fountain, there was a large hedge maze that I didn't recall being there before. The bushes were all unnatural shades of gray. It was lined with white roses I can't wait to paint red. I remember the feeling of Erica's hand in mine, the endless spirals of leaves surrounding us. Suddenly, Erica was no longer there. A ballerina, a lion with glazed eyes, a contortionist unfolding from the bushes and taking her. I gave chase. I tripped, ripping the hem of my dress. The once ambient music became louder and louder, rattling my skull. I ran and ran through the endless maze, following Erica's screams of my name till I could no longer hear her. I turned the corner and fell to my knees in the dusty fields just outside the circus gates. I ran to the gates and cried out panicked gasps as I shook the iron, but nothing moved. After what felt like an hour of shaking and banging till my hands bled, I once again fell to my knees. As the sun reappeared on the horizon, I rose, and I walked back to town with my head hung in defeat. The dusty paths turned to paved streets as I headed home. For the next 3 days, I laid in bed. A space in my arms where little Erica should have been. On the 3rd day, I heard a knock on my door. I was startled awake and stumbled out of bed to answer it. When I opened the door, there was nothing there but a little white flyer with the words "The Starlight Circus" printed in an ornate and swirling script. I flipped the paper around to see my name, Sadie, printed in handwriting. A sinister invitation. I don't know if this is the last night the circus will be here, but I do know that tonight I will take my revenge took her. And now, they will pay. Now, as the sun sets outside my window, I put on my finest black and white dress. I tie a red ribbon around my neck. I do my hair and my makeup. I sharpen my knife. I imagine the satisfaction that will come from that silver tip coated in red. At least, I think they bleed red. They took her. And now, they will pay. Good night, my dear diary. I hope to see you again soon. Love, Sadie.
Once you get to know her, Sadie is a really knife person. Next up, on K98.4, Alex Host, our local radio host, shares with us his experience. Won't that be fun? Oh, and don't worry about the
It's been a while since I had any visitors. I'm Alex Host, and I work for the town's radio station K98.4. I run a talk show called Nightlife from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Townsfolk call in and we talk about the gatherings around town, the latest movies, and on Saturdays we talk about the events of the week. I was really lucky enough to get this job until the 17th of September. It's been 4 months, and I still remember everything that happened that night. It was a normal Friday. I got a few people criticizing the movie that opened in the theater, someone talking about a bar crawl, and some dudes inviting girls over to their parties over the radio. It was just me, the producer, and Matthew in charge of tech, and whoever decided to call in. Around 11:15 is when I got my first call. It was a man. He didn't say anything. He didn't even say his name, so I started. Hello, you're on K98 Live. Welcome to the Nightlife.
Someone was outside my window.
And
I
all he
woke up
said
and
was,
someone was outside
there's
my
someone
window.
outside my window. I woke up, and there's someone outside my window. I didn't know how to respond, so I just asked him, Sir, have you been drinking tonight?
I had around
And
8.
he said he
but
had around
I
8.
came home early to go to bed.
And he went back home early to go to bed. I was about to ask another question when this loud static blasted from the phone. I didn't question it at the time. The lines here kind of suck a bit, so I apologized to my audience and continued. We started talking about the unexplained murder that happened at the Mclanda orchard. 15 minutes deep into the theories I'd heard, I got another call. It was Ronette Marie. Crazy Ronette Marie herself called from the town's diner, and she started talking about a teenager hurting her eyes with their new costume and playing their rap music too loud. I was gonna ask who was outside, but then I heard static again. I gave Matthew a small glare to see if he knew what was going on. An hour passed and we didn't get any more calls, so we just played music. After the 19th or so song, we got another caller. His name was Derek. He said something about a girl staring at him through his window, and when he yelled at her, she didn't respond. But as soon as he opened his door, she disappeared.
She was gone.
He asked if he could stay on the line until he calmed down.
Can you stay on the line with me until I calm down?
A few minutes go by after talking about how being a sophomore in college was. We get a second caller. I told Derek to turn on the radio and listen until the other call ended and he can call back. It was a man. Same story.
There was a figure staring at me.
It was a
when I
figure
woke
staring
up.
at him through his window. But This one had a small difference.
It hurt to look at the
He said it
figure.
hurt to look at the figure.
I don't know what's going on.
I told him we've been hearing a lot about this, but shutting your blind seemed to work.
You want me to shut my blind?
He thanked me
Thank you. Seemed to work.
and hung up. I didn't know what was going on. Would you have? I thought it was a prank being pulled on me. I mean, Derek didn't call back, so I thought it was all fake. As the night went on, I got more normal calls. Like a call out for someone to pick up their drunk friend, or the police telling the listeners not to drink and drive. But the previous calls stuck with me. What if there was actually someone walking through town watching people through windows? I was in the middle of a story about the Wednesday protest to protect the bog, and I got one final call. It was Derek. He sounded panicked. He said, there are more of them.
They're around the farmhouse.
They surrounded his farmhouse. And he called out to someone named Finn. I heard the phone drop and it was static. This time the static didn't stop. I looked up to Matthew, but the lights were off. So I stood up slowly. I walked into the tech room, only to bump into Matthew, and I could feel him grabbing onto my shirt, and he was shaking. I asked him where the light switch was, and he didn't respond, so I looked for it, and I flicked it on, and nothing. I flicked it back and forth to no avail, and there was nothing, and I grabbed Matthew and put him into the booth. Knowing I had a flashlight on me, I went back into the tech room, and I flicked it on, and that's when I saw a man. At least I think it was a man. I couldn't hear myself think. It hurt to look at the figure, and my flashlight started to flicker, and the figure moved closer and closer to my face, and the hand was inches away from my face, and then suddenly the lights turned on. It was just me and Matthew in an empty room. We ran to my car, and I took him home that night. I told him I won't be coming back to work tomorrow, and he laughed, a very quiet laugh, and agreed. But as I pulled away, I could have sworn I saw a figure in my rearview mirror.
I guess you must really love your job to go back after. And now let's turn our attention to Tyler, who recently went on a blind date with grave consequences. Even though it was a little awkward at first, she's really trying to make the best of a dire situation.
Where am I? I opened my eyes to an unfamiliar place. I checked the ticking on my watch, seeing that I had been unconscious for at least an hour. But from what I can tell, this isn't where I fell asleep. I reached in my back pocket and pulled out my phone, needing a source of light. I pushed myself off the ground, noticing my lack of stability. I rest my weight on a cold, hard surface. I flick my flashlight on to see the light beaming off the stone slabs and crosses scattered all around me. My senses began to sharpen as I take in my surroundings. I felt encompassed by fog and silence. I was alone, though I felt like I was being watched as I stumbled around looking for the way out. I started to hear an echo in my footsteps. I started to walk faster in the unknown direction I was going, my hands and cheeks going numb to the cold. As I continued forward, I noticed a frail figure ahead of me. I started to run towards them, not noticing the absence of the once overwhelming echo behind me. The closer I got, the farther I wanted to be from her, but I couldn't stop myself from migrating towards her. Her face was white. Her hair was dark and messy. She had big, beautiful, dead eyes.
Her tattered lace and smudged makeup became more apparent to me as I pulled closer to her. "Who are you?" I asked, but she just smiled at me and rested her hand on my cheek. With the other arm, she pulled me to a hug. I began to feel even dizzier than I already did from the alcohol I had earlier that night. I started singing a song I'd never heard before. I felt myself begin to drift asleep as she held me in her arms. Next thing I know, I'm in the driveway of the house I'd been partying at all night. Was that all a dream? I thought out loud. I pushed myself off the ground and stumbled home, where I was only a block away from the house party. When I got home, I migrated straight to my bedroom. Since that night, that ragged woman had been in every dream. I don't feel threatened by her. She never leaves.
She's so dreamy. The graveyard is on the northwest edge of town, on Lehman Way. It's not all that far from the Mclanda farm. That Finn Mclanda, he is the greatest farmer in the whole county. He really is outstanding in his field. But excellence comes at a cost, and Finn works to the bone to keep his farm churning out fresh produce.
He's always here on Saturdays. I haven't been to the town square once on a Saturday without him there. Finn Mclanda always sold his fresh fruit out on display for crazy prices. He always sold out, though. Most likely due to his charisma and his face. And his, well, everything. And he was so young, too. Only 26, and he was running the farm by himself. That in itself wasn't so odd about it. The odd part was the small sign always on display. Help wanted. I've seen people walk up and ask about the job vacancy, and even seen a few people get hired. But Finn always worked his stall alone. When I brought it up to my friends, they said that he probably needed people in the fields to tend to the plants, which made a bit of sense. But something felt off about how that sign was always there. I got so sick and tired of not knowing that I decided to ask for the job. I gathered my courage and walked right up to the stand and said, "Hello, Mr. Mclanda. I was curious if I could work for you." He smiled and pulled out the small clipboard he always pulls out when someone asks about the job.
"Have you worked with fruit before?"
he asked. I nodded. "My dad has a small apple tree and he lets me tend it." He checked a box on the clipboard.
"Do you have any experience with cutting meat?"
I tilted my head. He never sold meat. I shakily said, "Yes, I do." He checked another box.
"Fantastic. I sell meat here on Wednesdays, and no one I've met seems to be good at cutting the beef."
He put the clipboard down and told me to meet him at his farm the next day. But he didn't give me an address. He told me not to worry about it and smiled. The next morning, I woke up and went outside, only to find a note on my door. It read, My farm is down the road that leads west out of town. Look for the windmill. Finn. I pocketed my note and started to head towards Lehman Way, which was the only road to the west of town. After about 30 minutes, I saw a windmill on a large farm. Fruit trees, chickens, cows, corn, pumpkins. Finn had it all. I walked up to the off-white farmhouse and knocked on the door. Finn opened it, smiling. He looked like I had caught him in the middle of work. The fresh smell of blood coming from the kitchen and the precise cuts of steak lying on the cutting board. He offered me a glass of water and sat down with me at the kitchen table. We talked about my tasks for the day and discussed pay. He was going to pay me $18 for every hour I worked. It was a deal. I had to milk the cows, spread the fertilizer on the apple trees, then come inside and help to prepare the dinner Finn would be making for us. The cows were very easy to deal with, but I ran into some trouble with the fertilizer. It stunk so bad, like rotten fruit and a strange metal scent. I thought he just used the old apples for fertilizer, but the metallic scent felt weird. Wrong, almost. I got through a bag, but when I opened the next one, there was a bone in it. I thought it must have been from a spoiled piece of meat from one of the cows, which would explain the dried blood that lined the inside of the bag. After I finished, I went back into the farmhouse, only to find Finn cutting carrots and putting them into the stew. He told me to take a seat and drink the tea he made. I took a sip. It was kind of bitter, but I didn't want to be rude. We talked about how my duties went, and I told him about the bone I found. He turned to look at me, his smile gone and the shine in his eyes dim. He spoke in a low and cold tone.
Don't you go worrying about things that don't involve you, sugar. Just eat up.
He pushed a bowl of stew towards me and insisted I ate it all. It was really good. And then we started to talk about how long he'd had his farm, and I even found out he had a sister named Sarah who lives in town. Afterwards, he offered to drive me home. I thought my roommate would have been home since her car was still in the driveway, but a note said that she had gone to visit family for the rest of the summer. The note felt a bit sticky and had some stains on it. Probably because she made a sandwich just before she left for the long car ride. I took the note to Finn's truck and showed him it. He offered to let me stay with him if I ever felt lonely. How could I pass that up? And besides, I was gonna pick more apples tomorrow. Finn's apples are so good. It must be his fertilizer. It really brings the flavors to life.
And Finn is really fed up with you all.
What lies beyond the fields and pastures of the Mclanda farm? I cannot tell you.
Our little town has more secrets to share. If only you'd stay and listen.
Thanks for visiting Carnage Falls. We're nothing special, just a town like any other.
With folks like any other. We're probably not all that different from your hometown.
Everyday people going about their everyday lives.
Or deaths. Y'all come back now.
Or simply, don't go away.
You know what they say when you wind up in Carnage Falls.
Stay a while.
Stay forever.